You're tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, something deeper, a bone-level exhaustion that comes from pushing, planning, and trying to hold everything together with your bare hands. You've been forcing it, the relationship, the career move, the version of yourself you decided you were supposed to be by now, and somewhere beneath all that effort, there's a quiet voice asking, "What if this isn't working?" It isn't. Not because you're failing, but because force was never the answer. The Stoics knew something we keep forgetting. Marcus Aurelius ruled the most powerful empire on earth and still wrote, in private, about the uselessness of fighting what cannot be changed. Epictetus was born a slave and found more freedom in his mind than most kings ever tasted. Seneca, surrounded by wealth and power, kept reminding himself, and us, that the suffering we create through resistance costs more than the thing we're resisting ever could. These weren't passive men. They weren't quitters. They were builders, thinkers, warriors of the interior life. But they understood something profound, that there is a kind of effort that destroys you and a kind of release that sets you free. This video is about that release. 9 lessons, ancient wisdom. A different way to move through your life, not with less ambition, but with far less suffering. If that's exactly what you need right now, drop "I'm ready" in the comments. Let's walk through this together. Think about the last time you tried to force something that wasn't ready. Maybe it was a conversation that needed to happen before the other person was willing. Maybe it was a job you pushed yourself into, knowing it wasn't quite right, because waiting felt unbearable. Maybe it was love, holding on past the natural end, white-knuckling a connection that had already begun to breathe its last. What did that forcing cost you? Not in the obvious, surface-level way. Underneath the situation itself, in your nervous system, your sleep, your sense of self. Forcing things doesn't just drain energy, it distorts your relationship with reality. It trains you to believe that if you just try harder, push longer, want it more intensely, the world will eventually bend to your will. It won't. And the Stoics weren't the first to notice this. Long before Marcus Aurelius picked up his pen, the natural world had already made the argument. A river doesn't crash against a boulder and declare war. It moves around it, through the path of least resistance, and keeps going, not because it's weak, because it understands something about how the world actually works. Seneca wrote that he suffers more than necessary who suffers before it is necessary. But there's a companion truth to that. He also suffers more than necessary who suffers in the attempt to prevent what was always going to happen. Forcing things isn't strength, it's fear wearing the mask of action. When you force a relationship, you're afraid of loneliness. When you force a timeline, you're afraid of falling behind. When you force an identity, you're afraid that who you actually are isn't enough. The antidote isn't indifference. It isn't giving up. It's something far more precise, a conscious, practiced decision to stop fighting the current and start learning to swim with it. That practice begins with the first lesson. Lesson 1. Control what you can, release what you can't. The first and most foundational Stoic lesson sounds almost embarrassingly simple until you try to live it. There are things within your control and things that aren't. Your job, your only real job, according to Epictetus, is to know the difference. He called it the dichotomy of control, though you don't need the label. The idea stands on its own. Your thoughts, your choices, your responses, your values, these belong to you. The weather, other people's opinions, the economy, how your body ages, what someone else decides to feel about you, these do not. Simple. and yet most of your suffering probably lives in the second category. You lie awake at night rehearsing a conversation with someone who isn't there. You spend weeks anxious about a decision that hasn't been made yet by someone else. You contort yourself trying to manage how people perceive you, running subtle campaigns for approval that you don't even consciously realize you're running. All of that is energy poured into territory you don't own. Epictetus was enslaved. He had almost no physical freedom, almost no power over the circumstances of his daily life. And yet he developed one of the most liberated philosophical frameworks in human history, precisely because he was forced to understand, at the most visceral level, what was truly his and what wasn't. He wrote, "Make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens." That's not resignation, that's precision. That's the difference between a carpenter who blames the wood and one who learns to work with the grain. When you stop wasting energy on what you can't control, something unexpected happens. The things you can control, your attention, your discipline, your response, suddenly become more than enough. They become the whole game. Lesson 2. Stop arguing with reality. There is a version of suffering that has nothing to do with what actually happened and everything to do with your refusal to accept that it did. The relationship ended. The opportunity passed. The person you loved became someone you no longer recognize. These are facts. But somewhere in the gap between "this happened" and "I accept that this happened," most people set up camp and live there for years. Marcus Aurelius called this out directly. He wrote that when we suffer, we often suffer not from circumstances themselves, but from our judgment about them, the story we layer on top of reality. The situation is the situation. The pain we add by arguing with it, by insisting it should be different, by replaying it endlessly, hoping for a different outcome, that part is optional. This isn't cold. It isn't asking you to pretend you're not hurt. Acceptance doesn't mean approval. You can grieve a loss and still accept that it happened. You can wish things were different and still acknowledge that they're not. The two aren't in conflict. What doesn't work is the constant low-grade argument your mind runs, the one that starts with "but why" and "it shouldn't have" and "if only." That argument doesn't change anything. It only delays the moment when you can begin to move forward. The Stoics had a phrase, amor fati, love of fate, not passive tolerance, active embrace. The idea that whatever has happened is now the material you have to work with, and working with it fully is the only path to anything resembling peace. Stop arguing with the river. You're exhausting yourself, and the river isn't listening. Lesson 3. Let people be who they are. One of the quietest, most persistent ways we force things is in our relationships, not through dramatic control, but through the slow, constant pressure of wanting people to be different than they are. You know this feeling. The friend who never quite shows up the way you need. The parent who still triggers you with the same pattern they've always had. The partner whose habits you've been subtly trying to reshape for years, convinced that if they could just change this one thing, everything would be better. Marcus Aurelius, who dealt daily with senators, generals, and advisors far less thoughtful than himself, returned again and again in his private journals to this question: how do you deal with people who disappoint you without being consumed by it? His answer was compassion rooted in realism. He reminded himself that people act according to their own understanding, their own fears, their own history. When someone behaves badly, it isn't a personal assault on your world. It's simply who they are with the tools they currently have. This doesn't mean you accept mistreatment. Stoicism isn't a philosophy of endless tolerance. You are absolutely allowed to set limits, to walk away, to protect your peace. But there's a difference between changing what you allow and trying to change who someone fundamentally is. One is wisdom, the other is a project that will consume you and leave both of you worse off. When you release the need to fix or reshape the people around you, something shifts. You stop being disappointed by the gap between who they are and who you wanted them to be. You start seeing them more clearly and relating to them more honestly. Lesson 4. Your timing isn't the only timing. You had a plan, a timeline, a picture of where you'd be by a certain age, in a certain season of your life. And somewhere along the way, reality didn't cooperate. The Stoics would tell you this dissonance between the schedule you made and the one life is actually running is one of the most fertile grounds for unnecessary suffering. We live in a culture that has assigned timelines to everything: career milestones, relationship stages, emotional recovery. Even personal growth comes with an implied deadline, as though healing has a schedule and falling behind it is a moral failure. It isn't. Seneca observed that most of our anxiety isn't about what's happening. It's about what we've decided should be happening by now. We're not suffering from our actual circumstances half as much as we're suffering from the gap between our circumstances and our expectations. When you force a timeline, push a relationship to commit before it's ready, rush a creative project before it's ripe, pressure yourself to be over it before you've fully felt it, you're not accelerating anything. You're just adding noise to a process that has its own intelligence. Nature doesn't apologize for not blooming in winter. A tree doesn't force its fruit before summer, and yet somehow we've decided that we should be exempt from this, that willpower alone can override the natural timing of things. Your path is unfolding at exactly the pace it needs to, not because everything is destined, but because some things genuinely cannot be rushed without being ruined. Give the process what it actually needs: room. Lesson 5. Effort without attachment. Here is one of the most misunderstood ideas in Stoic philosophy, and one of the most liberating once you actually feel it in practice. You can work hard, care deeply, and give everything you have to something, without being destroyed if it doesn't turn out the way you hoped. This isn't about being detached or emotionally distant. It's about understanding the difference between what you can offer and what you can control about the outcome. Marcus Aurelius was a dedicated emperor. He worked tirelessly, made difficult decisions, campaigned through brutal winters, and poured himself into the governance of a civilization. And yet he was acutely aware, as his journals show, that results were never entirely his to command. He could act well, he could choose wisely, he could persist with integrity. What the world did with that was, to a meaningful degree, beyond him. Seneca framed it this way: put your full effort into the process and hold the outcome loosely. This is what athletes call being in the zone, that rare state where you're fully engaged with what you're doing without the white-knuckle anxiety of needing a particular result. Paradoxically, that release of attachment often produces better outcomes because you're working from clarity instead of fear. The forcing energy, the desperate outcome-fixated striving, is almost always counterproductive. It tightens you, it narrows your vision, it makes the work about survival rather than craft. Do the work, do it fully, do it with everything you have. And then, genuinely, not performatively, let it go. The Stoics weren't asking you to care less. They were asking you to suffer less about what was never yours to guarantee. Lesson 6. Silence the inner prosecutor. There's a voice most people carry around that is relentlessly unkind. It catalogues your failures. It revisits your worst moments with precise photographic accuracy. It compares you, always unfavorably, to some imagined version of yourself that you haven't managed to become yet. The Stoics called this kind of thinking a distortion, not a truth-teller but a tyrant, one that lives inside you and demands a trial you can never win. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about not adding unnecessary suffering to difficulty. You face a hard moment. That moment is real, and the pain is real. But then the inner prosecutor arrives and layers on top of it. You should have known better. This is who you are. You'll never get this right. And suddenly, you're not just dealing with the moment. You're dealing with a verdict about your entire worth as a person. That verdict is not evidence. It's a habit. Self-examination, genuine, honest reflection on where you fell short and what you can learn, is deeply Stoic. Marcus Aurelius did it every night. But there's a crucial difference between honest self-assessment and relentless self-punishment. One helps you grow, the other just keeps you bleeding. You cannot move forward well from a place of contempt for yourself. The forcing that happens internally, the way you push against your own humanity, demand perfection from your own imperfect nature, generates its own exhaustion. Treat yourself, the Stoics suggest, the way you would treat a student you genuinely care about. Correct with clarity. Move on with intention. Stop prosecuting the parts of yourself that simply needed more time, more wisdom, or more grace. Lesson 7. Stop forcing yourself to feel different. You're sad or anxious or numb in a way you can't quite name. And somewhere underneath those feelings is another layer, a judgment that you shouldn't be feeling this way, that it's been long enough, that someone with your advantages, your knowledge, your supposed self-awareness should be past this by now. So you force it. You perform okayness. You try to logic your way out of grief, or meditate your way past anxiety that hasn't finished speaking yet, or stay busy enough that you don't have to feel what's actually there. The Stoics were not advocates of emotional repression. This is one of the most persistent misreadings of their philosophy. They did not say, feel nothing. They said, understand what you feel and don't be ruled by it. There's an enormous difference. Seneca wrote that you should let your emotions move through you, not calcify inside you. Observe what you're experiencing with honesty and without drama. Name it. Let it be what it is. Don't amplify it by catastrophizing, but also don't strangle it by pretending it isn't there. Forcing yourself to be positive before you've processed what's actually happening isn't Stoic. It's suppression. And suppression is just emotion on a delay. It doesn't disappear. It just waits. What the Stoics offer instead is presence. Sit with what's true. Let the feeling exist without letting it dictate everything. Acknowledge it the way you'd acknowledge rain. Real, sometimes inconvenient, and not permanent. Your feelings aren't a problem to be solved. They're information to be received. Stop trying to force them into shapes they're not ready to take. Lesson 8. Trust the slow work. We have become deeply uncomfortable with slowness, with the idea that some things take years, that wisdom, genuine change, meaningful relationships, real mastery, these are not things you can sprint toward. They are things you inhabit slowly through 1,000 quiet days of showing up. The Stoics lived in a world without instant feedback, no metrics telling them whether they were growing fast enough, no external validation to confirm that the inner work was paying off. Just the daily practice of trying to be better, not as a performance for anyone else, but as a private commitment to what Marcus Aurelius called living according to nature. And nature, as we keep coming back to, does not rush. Seneca said something striking. that the person who chases two goals at once often catches neither. There is a kind of forceful, scattered striving that mistakes frantic motion for progress and ends up arriving nowhere, out of breath, having missed the actual work that was available to them the whole time. Trust the slow work. Trust that the therapy session that felt unproductive was not. Trust that the book you read and barely remember left something in you. Trust that the discipline you're building, even imperfectly, even inconsistently, is accumulating in ways you can't yet see. This is perhaps the hardest lesson for anyone living in a culture of optimization and rapid results. But the Stoics would tell you the depth of your growth is inversely proportional to the urgency with which you tried to force it. Let the work be slow. The roots go deeper that way. Lesson 9. Peace is a practice, not a destination. Here is the thing about inner peace that nobody tells you, and that the Stoics understood completely. You don't arrive at it. You don't fix enough things, complete enough lessons, or reach a certain level of self-awareness, and then live there permanently. Peace is something you practice daily, imperfectly, in the middle of traffic, in the middle of grief, in the middle of uncertainty, in the moments when everything in you wants to grip and force and resist. Marcus Aurelius wrote his private reflections every single day, not because he had mastered Stoicism, but because he hadn't. Because he was a human being, fighting the same battles you're fighting, needing the same reminders you need. He was the most powerful man in the known world, and he still had to remind himself on a Tuesday morning to stop trying to control what wasn't his. That's the practice. Not forcing doesn't mean drifting. It means moving with intention rather than desperation. It means choosing engagement over compulsion. It means returning again and again to the question, is this within my control? And if it isn't, releasing it, fully and without guilt, and redirecting your energy toward what is. You will forget this. You'll catch yourself forcing something, a conversation, a feeling, an outcome, and you'll have to come back to this understanding again. That's not failure. That's the practice working exactly as it's supposed to. Stop forcing, start flowing, and trust, deeply quietly, that the life you've been straining toward has been waiting for you to simply let it arrive. If something in this video quietly shifted something in you, even just a little, drop "I'm letting go" in the comments. You'll be surprised how powerful it feels to say it out loud. And if this kind of thinking speaks to you, subscribe to the Stoic mode and turn on notifications. There's so much more wisdom where this came from. Thank you for being here and for being honest enough with yourself to watch something like this. Now, go live, not by force, but by choice.